our laptop says slightly earlier than 3 o'clock, so I'll take my time and just get warmed up a bit before I do anything serious. All right. So it's Saturday. It's 3 o'clock in the UK. Should be about 11 a.m. on the East Coast. This is Free Association, which is a radio show that came out of a group that I ran in Newcastle last year. And it's a word association group essentially, but you can go anywhere with it. You can go with stories, analogies, memories, any kind of thing you like. You can go light, you can go dark, you can go anywhere you want with it, but it starts with a word and then we associate into movies or culture or memories or whatever it is from that word. We might go back to another word afterwards, but you can usually get a good conversation out of just one word. It triggers people off, so we'll see how things go. Thanks, Doc. At least I know I can be heard. That's a good sign. I wanted to talk a little bit just about the week before I get started. My week has been a bit up and down, for obvious reasons. There's a bit of a curfew going on here. I'm in the UK. I'm in Newcastle, which is in the north of England. So at the moment we're in full lockdown for at least another couple of weeks, but in theory probably for 3 months. There's a 3-week kind of curfew going on, stay at home kind of idea as much as possible. So I'm allowed, when I say allowed, I don't mean allowed. That's just the word that I use. So what I can do is I can go out for a walk once a day. I can go for food when it's necessary, once a day. Apart from that, I've got to stay in my apartment most of the time. I've still got to go backwards and forwards if I'm doing washing or whatever, and I go around the block sometimes because I need to keep moving. So if my back starts to seize up a little bit or gets tight, I'll go for a walk, and that's it, because that's a health reason, so that's reasonable. I try and get at least 5,000 steps in a day. I've got a route set up now, up to the local park and back, which is getting me about 4,500 steps. So if I do that twice a day, if the weather's decent, which it isn't today, but on a good day when the sun's reasonably high in the sky and if it's more than 10 degrees, then I'll probably do that twice a day until I get told not to, and sit on a bench in the park for 10 minutes at the other end. So that's kind of my routine at the moment. The staying indoors order is enforced by an order in Parliament now. There's a law passed so that the police can fine you if you're outside more often than they want you to be, or in groups of more than 2 people. If you live with somebody and you're in a relationship, that's fine, but if you're outside on the street with somebody that you're not living with or not in a relationship with, they're probably going to fine you, because there was a story on the radio this morning about an old couple walking their dog in the park in London being fined by the police, which is a bit ridiculous, quite honestly, but that's the way it is, so that's what we've got to do. That's what we've got to deal with. I'm not sure it'll last 3 months, because I think there's stuff going on that's not public. I think it might be less than that. The figures that people are working with keep changing. The Imperial College model, which is the one that's informing the health decisions, has just changed from 250,000 dead to about 5,000 dead now. So that's a big difference because of the social distancing and the isolation that's going on. So once they've modelled that, and once they've got figures and they can put the figures into their model, it becomes a more accurate model. So then the advice that's being given to the people in the government will change. So I'm thinking that it'll be less than 3 months, but it's probably going to be more, a month or more. I would think we're expecting a peak in about 3 weeks' time, according to what I read a few minutes ago. And there was 260 people died yesterday, and there's now 1,000 cases in the UK. Now, that's all I'm going to say about coronavirus, because it's not a coronavirus show, but I wanted to get that in just in case people don't know the stats or don't know what's happening in the UK. It's worth me just putting a little bit in there. So my anxiety levels have been going up and down a little bit as I've been watching these statistics and listening to what the government's telling people to do. I go in and out of listening to David Icke and listening to the BBC and listening to LBC, which is a UK commercial broadcasting network, a radio network. So I don't know what happened there, but this Skype's making noises, and I don't know why it's making noises. I'll carry on regardless. So anyway, if I'm not on air, I'm sure you'll tell me. So moving on to the main part of the show, what I do is a little bit of emotional freedom technique. There's plenty of emotional roller coaster stuff going on at the moment, so I'm just going to do a little bit of work around anxiety, around fear again. I'll keep doing this until there's less fear around, basically. So we'll start with just a little bit of an explanation of what emotional freedom technique is. Emotional freedom technique is a technique that uses affirmations and some tapping. What I do is I tend to tap on the inside of my left hand with the fingers on my right hand, but you can do it the other way around, it doesn't matter. That's enough. You don't need to worry about the other points, really. It's a radio show, not a therapy session. So, and it'll work just the same. I do this at work, quietly in the corner, and it works for me to produce connections with customers in a call center that I work in. So we'll just do a bit of tapping. Just on fear and anxiety. I've got some anxiety around my mother's response to this virus. She's frightened and she's self-isolating with my stepdad. She'll be fine, but she's scared, and I'm concerned for her because she's frightened, and that affects me. So I'm going to do some tapping around that, because that's one of the things that came up this week. And you can generalize it to fear about infection or fear about friends and family being infected. It doesn't have to be about your mother. So just pick a topic to tap on that's around that area, that's that type of question that brings up fear for you, and just tap along with me. I know you can't see this, but I'm tapping on the fleshy bit of the inside of my hand by the small finger, with all four fingers of the other hand. As I say, it doesn't matter which way around you do it. So it starts with a setup. I've got to come up with a number first of all for the level of anxiety, and it's not huge, but it's a 3 or 4, I think, there. So 3 or 4 coming down to a 1 or maybe a 0 would be good if we can aim for something like that. It just depends how much tapping you do and how you feel, and where it starts and where it ends is up to you, really. I'm just going to tap and probably keep tapping until I get it down to a 1 or a 0. So just say something like, even though I'm frightened for my mother, I'm frightened for my friends and my family, I wholly and completely love, honor, and accept myself. Even though this virus is frightening people, and the response of the government is frightening people, I wholly and completely love, honor, and respect myself. Accept and respect. So this anxiety about my mother is in the background. Usually when I speak with her, I'll spend a day thinking about her response. So it's in the background when I'm talking to other people as well. So even though I have this anxiety, I wholly and completely love, honor, and accept myself. And even though the world seems to have gone a little bit insane with paranoia and fear, even though the reports from the hospitals are quite frightening, and the reports in the media of death and infection rates is quite frightening, I wholly and completely love, honor, and accept myself. So this fear, it's a fear of death, really. It's a fear of my death and a fear of other people dying that I'm close to. So even though I have this fear of death, and it's brought up by the virus, the virus becomes a trigger for the fear that was in there underneath everything else. Even though I have this fear, I wholly and completely love, honor, and accept myself. Right, I'm just going to check in and see where I am with the level of fear. And this does bring stuff up for me. It makes me, it changes my emotional state a little bit when I'm doing it. So I know it's tapping into something, even though I might not think that the fears level's very high. It does tap into something. So I think I'm probably still at a 3. So I'm going to do another round and see if we can get it down a little bit. It has brought some emotion up though. So I'll have to start once it's moving. So back to the tapping. So even though I have this fear of death that the virus is triggering, even though I have this anxiety about my friends, I wholly and completely love, honor, and accept myself. So even though this fear is in the background, when I'm speaking with people, I wholly and completely love, honour, and accept myself. Fear can be rational. There's some fear that is rational. But there's other fears that are not rational. And I just want to let go of any unnecessary fear, any unnecessary anxiety. So just set the intention to let go of the fear and anxiety. Right, I think that's probably enough. And just take a deep breath, relax a little bit, stretch your arms out if you're following along. Breathe from your belly 2 or 3 times. And just check in and see what kind of level of fear there is there now. I think I've dropped 1 point on that one, so not a huge amount, but a start. So that's not bad in 10 minutes, I think. So, all right. So I don't know if you're available, Lenny. I'm going to see if I can set Skype up a little bit. Now, how do I do that? Let's have a look. No, I don't want to share screen. What I want to do is add Lenny Thyme. So let's see if we can do that.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Lenny. Here we go. I've got a picture now, so I can see who I'm talking to.
Oh, okay. I see your picture is actually the chat room.
Is it? All right. That's because it said, "Do you want to share your screen?" And I said yes, and then I decided against it. But we can do that. We can do it that way if we want to.
Sure. I just turned off the radio, so now I'm on Skype alone with you and listening. So we are good.
All right.
I'm ready
Excellent.
for self-association.
All right. A little bit of free association. So
Wait. I said self-association.
yeah, you did.
Aren't I supposed to be isolated?
Well, you could be. You can be isolated. Can you be isolated when we're all interconnected anyway?
That's a good question. I don't know. I do appreciate being in the chat room. It's a good place to be, but am I really associated with the other chatters? Or is it just a ephemeral association where we think we're there, but we're not quite there?
I tend to assume that anything I'm saying to somebody else is something that I should be saying to myself, as a general rule. So that to me is what the chat room's for. Whatever I say in the chat room, and whatever I say on here, I'm saying to myself ultimately.
Okay, that makes sense. So, what is our word to associate with today?
Oh, I haven't quite got that far yet, Lenny.
Okay.
Um, I don't know why I haven't quite got that far, but I haven't. So I'll just Yeah, I'll just give a little bit of history and then we'll get into it because it'll give me time to think about it. So the free association part of the program is based on a group that I used to run in Newcastle, which is a philosophy group. So it comes from a philosophy group. It's not necessarily a philosophy part of a radio show, but it can be. It gives people the option of using words that they might not use normally. So it's a way of playing with words, really, and playing with the meaning of words, playing with the connections between words. So we can just start with self if you want, because you brought it up. That's as good a place to start as any.
Okay, you want me to start this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, in this world of self-isolation, figuring out who self is one of those most important tasks. And I think a lot of people have lost track of self in the idea of being in bigger groups because we tend to have been told to associate with a lot of groups that define us as opposed to defining ourselves on human scale. So when I look at myself on human scale, I consider myself to be a group of one. And I look at myself and say, okay, what does this group of one wish to do? And since I don't have to discuss that group of one with anyone else, I'm the only person in it, I can pretty much set my intention so that my group of one was tapping when you were doing the EFT. And I tend to use two fingers and tap on the inside of my left hand just above the wrist. But as you said, that's open to anyone. After my group of one has decided what it wants to do, then I step back and look at the group of one of all humans on human scale together. And I check to make sure that my individual group of one does something that's acceptable by the total human standards of the large group of one. And then if both groups of one are copacetic with each other, then I start thinking about, okay, let's go to human scale in a group of two. In those group of twos, like right now, we are a group of two, Dennis and Lenny talking on Revolution Radio Studio B. Our group of two has an agreement to talk about word association, but we can take it wherever we want to go. So the self part of me is listening to the self part of you, and together we become a higher order self, a group of two. If somebody would join us in on air instead of in the chat room, we might be a group of three, but on human scale for an individual, once you get much bigger than a group of five, it's hard to be in a group and still find full meaning within that group. On the other hand, now in Revolution Radio chat room, we're a group of 32. And so each one of us as an individual can provide our input by tapping the keys and making a comment. But then after that, it's up to other members of the group of 32 to respond to that comment. And I don't think we ever form a consensus in the group of 32. If we're listening to a host on the radio, then we're commenting either positive or negative in relationship to what that host is talking about. And so we can see where there is either consensus or not consensus. But I wonder if human scale really needs a consensus to function. I know I can always get consensus in my group of one at human scale because I'm the only one I have to deal with. But even over time, you and I have had times when we're not in consensus, but we have ground rules on how to approach each other so that we can talk about it and in the end agree to disagree if we haven't convinced each other of our perspective. But those perspectives that we hold need to be different because it would be an awful boring world if we all thought the same way and said the same things, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Diversity is one of the things that's an integral part of being human. Everybody's got that difference, got that diversity apart with it from each other. But there's so much in common that the diversity, sometimes the diversity takes over and runs away with itself, I think.
I wonder if we haven't been taught to be disagreeable to each other just to draw more opinion out of the other person, that sometimes we contest each other not because we don't believe in what the other is saying, but just to sort of broaden the perspective and get more into the reasons underlying why we think the way we do.
Yeah, and sometimes it just takes time. Like when we used to talk, when you used to talk about timelines, when we were doing the New Way show,
Yes.
I didn't really get what you were talking about. But I've just found an audio on YouTube which is reality transurfing, which he talks about lifelines. And when he talks about lifelines, what he means from your language, that's a timeline. Well, you're talking about group timelines and individual timelines, but an individual timeline is a lifeline. And it's just different words for the same thing. But now that I've got that language, I can link it with your language and it makes more sense.
Yeah, I agree in that when I speak about timelines, I have several different meanings based on the scale that we're talking about. But each of us lives on our own unique timeline. And if we want to change the force of that timeline, it starts with self as an individual and deciding that the way things have been going is not to our liking and we want to change the direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that matches up with a lot of stuff I've been listening to from Neville Goddard recently, where his main thing is imagination creates reality.
Yeah, last night I was listening to Magenta Pixie on my Discord channel, and I saw that she had popped in and she was talking about timelines. She identified four different timelines of possibility coming from the immediate now, going from everything from a total apocalypse to a total freedom of choice. And I find that Magenta Pixie, as a British person who talks to the collective of nine, has a way different perspective from almost anyone else out there on the internet. And I find that the more I listen to people whose perspective is way out there, the more I can broaden my own individual perspective to include things that I hadn't previously considered.
Yeah, it definitely helps when there's an input from left field or right field or wherever from the fringe. It livens things up. You've got to rethink at least a little bit of how you think. If there's somebody challenging from that far away, you have to start thinking, well, how is it that that distance exists?
I find for me, I like the fringes on both sides way better than I like what I call the muddle in the middle. And that if I have to deal with much of the muddle in the middle, it bothers me because it tells me that the people aren't really thinking, they're just regurgitating what they had heard. But sometimes we do that just to take a perspective that's different from our own and work it through within our own system. So there are times when I will get to talking where some of the stuff I'm saying is out far enough that I'm not even sure I believe what I'm talking about. But if I set the mindset that I want to develop a certain perspective, I don't really need to be exact to my reality until after I'm done with the perspective development.
Yeah, yeah, it's like wearing a new set of clothes. You get a new viewpoint. It's like putting on a new set of clothes. You can put them back in the wardrobe when you're done with them, but you'll always have that experience.
I can't remember the last time I got a new set of clothes.
Well,
Then again,
I don't get them often, but I do have some here and there.
well, you have to because you're working and or have been working. And when you have a job, there's certain things that you have to do to meet the expectation of the people around you. I consider a job to be something that keeps people just over broke. And so my preference is to work on things that I'm interested in and not worry about the exchange of goods, services, and finances, except to figure out how that would have to work on human scale. Because if everything blows up and goes away at the big scale, we're going to be left looking at each other, wondering how we're going to feed, clothe, and relate to each other. And so the human scale that I continually harp on is to make sure that each of us as an individual is self competent. And then once you're self competent, you can work with others to bring their perspective up to your own. But again, we don't want everybody thinking like Dennis or Lenny because that wouldn't get us anywhere. We really want to have a diversity of perspectives that can merge so that when we get together as our group of the whole at any different scale, the whole can see what to do, and really, a group of two is more than just two groups of one because the dynamic of the interaction makes things happen that you just can't do in a group of one.
Yeah, there's an extra thing that happens when there's a conversation with somebody. I mean, even to some extent, my group of one gets a bit confused in itself because I just end up arguing with myself a lot of the time. My opinions about everything that's going on at the moment change on a almost hourly basis. So I come across a new piece of information and I go, oh wow, that might be right. And then an hour later, I'll read something else that's saying the opposite, and I'll go, oh wow, that might be right. And then I've got to kind of integrate them a little bit and come up with a version of the two things that make sense to me. But it's an ongoing process. I know that much.
When you talk to yourself as a group of one, do you talk to yourself in the first person or in the third person?
Uh, First person, so I'm flipping between one viewpoint and the other.
Yeah, sorry about the phone call. It'll stop ringing in a moment. Um, Yeah, I tend to talk to myself sometimes in the third person when I want to dissociate myself from the perspective that I'm espousing in order to really look at it and see if it integrates or disintegrates. But sometimes I find that a long term perspective that I held was disintegrating on the basis of further information. Right now, I find it very difficult to get information from the media. I find that the lamestream media gives me one large volume of stuff from a single perspective, and they're so lockstep anymore that you can't get around the feeling that they're just ordering you to think like they do. But then I take the alternate media perspective, and it seems like it's knee jerk response to the lamestream perspective. So there's also a single perspective that you're supposed to take to be considered alternative media. And I hear a lot of people just repeating antagonism towards the first perspective such that it becomes an either or situation. And I don't think we live in a duality. I think that we have an imposed duality so that 60% of the people think one way and 40% of the people think the opposite of the 60%. And that's close enough that they can battle. And when it gets close to 50-50, that what you have is complete polarization. Whereas as an individual self, there's always a new concept that you can bring into any debate and look at it from a completely different perspective than either and or. And that allows us into neither and nor, so that we can ignore both mainstream and alternative news perspectives and come up with our own truth.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and I can integrate the two together to some extent. I mean, I'm playing with the ideas of Neville Goddard, which is imagination creates reality. So the, basically the feeling of having something produces the thing that you feel that you have. And then if you look at something like 9/11, there was a drill on the day of 9/11 for almost exactly the scenario that happened. On the 7/7 bombing, there was a drill on the day of the 7/7 bombing for almost exactly the scenario that happened. Recently, the pandemic drills have been happening, and then we end up with a large pandemic. So there's something about imagination in the form of a drill that might be having a creative effect. I'm not saying there's not other things going on as well, but that's the bit that I'm focusing on at the moment when I'm thinking about it.
Do you think that because you believe in a certain reality, that makes that reality real?
From the individual point of view, yes, because you've got a bit of cognitive bias kicking in. So you start to see evidence for the viewpoint that you're taking. I do anyway.
So, in essence, each of us as a self professed individual has the ability to change our own personal reality.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm working with at the moment. That's what I'm playing with at the moment. And I'm going to have plenty of time to do it by the looks of it because I'm not working at the minute either. So I've got 18 hours a day to think about these things and watch YouTube videos and do some research. And if you think about it, if I was thinking about this when I traced back all the stuff that's going on at the moment to the model at Imperial College in London, the pandemic model, all the modelling is being done there. So the assumptions that they make for that model have an impact on a large proportion of the government responses. So all it takes is one of those assumptions to change, and the model produces different figures, and then the behaviour of the government and the recommendations change. So it is about assumption. It's about assumptions creating reality.
I have to agree with you. I worked in the 1990s with a fellow who was participating in bringing in a climate change model. And one of the things that I found very awkward was that he said he couldn't talk about what's in the model. And I, as a scientist, said, well, if you can't tell me what's in your model, I can't agree to accept your model because I don't know what the basis set is. So he went one way and I went a different way. And for climate change, I think the skeptical environmentalist by a guy named Bjorn Lomborg, who used to work for Greenpeace. He wrote that in the late 1990s, but he went in as a Greenpeace person going to try and accept what they said about climate change. And by the end of his book, he proved that the whole thing was mostly nonsense. But the person that I knew who was creating the climate change model apparently built a model that totally ignores water vapor, which is about 3% of what's in the air, but doesn't ignore carbon dioxide, which is about 0.5% of what's in the air. So now that model has been generally accepted by the Al Goreites and the other liberals of the world, and it just is a false model that's based on a non-reality set up by people imagining how things are going to work. And to tell you the truth, that's all models are. They are representations of the reality, but once you've looked at a model and seen what it projects, you really have to step back and look at the reality and see where it differs from the model and work on improving the model.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just this core thing of assumptions creating reality. When you look at it from there, if I make the assumption that everybody in the world is potentially hostile or potentially infected with a virus, that's a huge assumption to make. It's going to affect my psychology. It's going to affect my behavior. It's going to affect my relationships. It's going to affect how I interact with people people who I don't know, people who I know well. All of those things. So that one assumption, which is the assumption that's underlying a lot of the government advice, I was questioning that on Facebook the other day with some people I've known for 40 years. And they were having a go at me because I was asking the question, like, why do I have to assume that everybody's infected with a virus when they clearly aren't infected with a virus? I can stay away from people. I can stay 2 meters away from people without assuming that they're infected with a virus. I can just assume that staying 2 meters away is good behavior for my health. I don't have to make an assumption about the other person at all.
I have to agree with you. My assumption on the virus is it's much ado about nothing, but my assumption on the effect of the so-called virus is that we've got governments all around the world applying draconian measures on their populations in fear of a boogeyman.
Yeah, it's basically paranoia. It's an invisible enemy that you're seeing everywhere.
So if the reality is that the paranoia is generated by the media, the government, and their favorite persons, perhaps us working on individual scale in self-isolation gives us time to come up with other ways of doing things, and those ways really involve measuring what is. So we've all got the opportunity to measure something on our own at human scale, and if we don't really discuss what we're measuring with other people and just measure it, write down a little bit of data, keep a data table, make a chart, see how things are, when we actually get to relating to each other again after the self-imposed epidemic is done, we can maybe learn different things.
Yeah, I think my relationship with government health advice has definitely changed. I'm still doing what they're asking me to do, though, but I'm doing it from the perspective that it's in my interests to keep myself healthy. And if the advice is 2 meters, then you can't stay 2 meters away from people all the time. I mean, if you're in a small shop and you're walking past somebody, you're immediately about a foot away from them rather than 3 foot away. So all you've got to do is just nod at them and they nod back at you, and you both know that the 2 meters is probably nonsense, but that everybody's trying to do it, so we just go along with it. Sometimes we even say that to each other in the shop sometimes.
Yeah, I think that respecting what other people expect is something that's good for self-preservation, and that whether we believe it or not, at this moment, it's not time to stand out in a crowd and make yourself totally visible as being in opposition to the way everybody thinks. However, as we get more and more self-isolated, the way that everybody thinks is going to be based on the information they get. And so shutting down the internet and shutting down the televisions is just going to give people more time to think on their own. But I don't think any of the information that we're getting from the internet or the mainstream media through television, movies, and that is really valid information that we should be working with. The problem is that we've become so compartmentalized as to the information that we can handle that we rely on experts to tell us how it is, and those experts have not been seeing things in our individual favor.
Yeah, it's like the only person who can really have my interest at heart is me, because other people have got other things that they need to think. Well, they're all thinking about their own interest. So Greenpeace in that case is thinking about the interests of Greenpeace as an organisation, rather than the interests of the individual members, to some extent at least. I mean, they're not as bad as a lot of people, but they do all right, Greenpeace. But they still, as an organisation, organisations always try and increase their resources to some extent.
I think the idea of government at the scale that we have it now is going to be one of the things that this disease takes care of. Whether it's a true virus or not a true virus, I think relying on people who live thousands of miles or hundreds of miles away to make decisions on local things is going to break down. I think once the food chain falls apart and we're no longer able to receive food from vast distances, that what's going to happen is that people are going to realize that they have to raise their own food within their local community.
Yeah, I think definitely the supply chain is going to change. A lot of the outsourcing that was going on for essential stuff, like even like pharmaceuticals and health supplies and all that, that's the obvious stuff at the moment. But then if you look at other things that have been outsourced, um, like furniture and furniture is the obvious one because I've been buying furniture recently, and some of it's coming from China. But lots of little things, gadgets all come from China now. Anything electronic is probably going to have some of its components made in China or India. So if and when that supply chain breaks down, you lose the ability to buy your gadgets.
I think that what we're going to find is a totally different ethic is going to be needed to live locally 2 months from now. That the things that we use and throw away are going to have to be used and reused in the future. Not talking about things like tissues that you can't reuse, but anything that has an intrinsic value to do something that we need, once it wears out and we have to throw it away, we're no longer going to be able to replace it. And so keeping things around for replacement parts and learning how to reassemble components into new materials, that's going to be skills that we're going to have to develop on the fly.
Yeah, it means that people are going to have to find plastics to replace the plastics that still aren't recyclable, amongst other things.
Well, it's interesting because plastics, the whole concept, is something in chemistry we call polymerization, and that's taking small components and linking them together to make bigger components. But the reactions are pretty much not reversible. Once you've taken small things and put them together to make bigger things, taking the bigger things apart does not get you back to the smaller things. And so that's a concept that in chemistry I've integrated, but in life skills, I don't think any of us have even considered.
No, I mean it equally applies, I suppose, to small charities merging and becoming a larger charity. They stop being small, so they stop being the thing that they used to be. And you can probably never go back to the ethos of a small charity once it's merged with another charity to make it bigger.
Yeah, and even defining what a charity is right now, I think that that's something that a lot of people have a lot of different ideas of what a charity is and how it's supposed to work. But a lot of things that I see, a lot of these things running around as charities are really non-governmental organizations that are huge, work with governments to steer the direction of populace and don't really have anything to do with human scale. I look at something like the Red Cross and I'm horrified that the management of the Red Cross gets 90% of the material wealth from the donations that they collect, and very little goes back into the purpose of the Red Cross, which is well, what is the purpose of the Red Cross?
It's medical support in disasters, or medical support in, where I am, it's sporting events or large events, isn't it?
Yeah, I used to give blood to the Red Cross, and when I found out that they were spinning the blood down, separating the plasma and selling it to pay for executive salaries and not really using my blood as donation to people who needed blood, I lost confidence in that organization totally.
Right. Okay. That, I don't know whether that's just a thing about the American Red Cross. I've never heard that in the UK. I'll investigate though, just in case they are doing it.
I'd like to know the results of your investigation. That was many years ago that I had heard that, but I heard it from people who at the time I believed in, and so it made sense to me to withdraw my personal consent. And I think that when we work from human scale, that's the only thing that we have that can impact on the mass of the whole population, is that if we require consensus to do something instead of a simple majority as is enforced in the government now, that maybe determining what consensus reality will change as we all develop an idea that consensus has to include us, and if we disagree with something, then they don't have consensus.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm experimenting with the idea that I can change almost anything in my reality just by imagining the way I want it to be and feeling the way that I want it to be. There's something that Neville Goddard said in one of his lectures that I listened to, which was when you meet somebody like begging on the street or whatever, imagine them with with self-confidence and with the ability to do a job and with the things that they would probably want for themselves. So I've been doing that with the people I've been meeting at the soup kitchen, and I think it's starting to work. But again, that could be my cognitive bias because I'm looking for things that make it seem like it's working. So it's difficult to know.
Tell me more about Neville Goddard. Who is he, and where would I find him? What types of things does he talk about?
Well, he's kind of a, a a mystic of sort. It's really what he does is take a Hindu uh, way of looking at the world, or a Buddhist way of looking at the world, where the Buddha is in me and is in you, and he applies that to Christianity. So he comes to the conclusion basically that everybody is Christ. Christ is human imagination, and human imagination creates reality. That's the 3-sentence summary of everything he says. But he's all over the internet, all over the YouTube at the moment. So there's lots of people reading the old lectures from the 30s, 40s. I think he died in 1972. So there's stuff from the 50s, 60s, 70s. There's quite a lot of lectures online. So there's a lot of biblical references, but because I know some of the ways approaching it is Hindu, I can get into it from that perspective and from the Buddhist perspective. Go ahead, sorry.
Sounds to me that he's a lot like Alan Watts.
It's similar. There's a good amount of philosophy in there, and it's very kind of, it's merging things together. But he is quite preachy, because it's a lot of biblical references, but there's a lot of personal stories in there. There are illustrations of what he means, and there's a lot of references to stuff that's going on in the 30s and the family history and stuff like that. So it's not all the Bible, but it does have a lot of Bible in it. And I'm just kind of at the point where I don't mind the biblical references as long as I don't have to take anything literally.
Yeah, I have gotten much more tolerant of biblical references and people who believe in the Christ character, and that because it makes sense to me that we're allowed to think differently. We're supposed to come up with conclusions that work for each of us and work for all of us. And those are the two ones that I was explaining at the start about human scale, that we want to be on human scale for ourselves personally in dealing with other humans, but we do need to step back and look at the all human scale and figure out how that's got to work so that we respect human dignity, not impose on it.
Yeah, so from the perspective that I'm at the moment, that would be if I can find some evidence that my imagination can change my life without me doing all that much about it, that it just produces a process that produces the outcome that I'm looking for. If I can prove that to me, then that means if my individual imagination produces my life, then collective imagination produces collective lives.
That makes sense to me. So maybe collectively we should all see that this virus is going to dissipate and we're going to be left in a world that some of our institutions have lost our trust. We need to replace those institutions.
Or maybe we need to imagine those institutions behaving in a different way rather than replacing them. I don't know. I'm just playing with the ideas, but rather than replacing, if something exists and it's behaving in a way that I don't like, if I can influence that with just a thought of it behaving in a more appropriate way, it's easier to imagine something than to tear it down and start again, I think.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on the show. I see we got the break coming on. It's been a wonderful time.
Oh, it's been good. It's always good, Lenny. You're welcome to come on anytime you like. If you've got something to say, you're welcome to just let me know and I'll bring you on.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Lenny.
Take care.
All the best to you. Right. I'm gonna say ta-ra, and I'll be back next week at the same time. Thanks for listening, folks.